So just as you saw in the previous tutorial, first you want to make sure you know which way your fur is facing, and this will help you to get a more natural looking fabric piece. So we are going to smooth it out and then place our pattern piece down. You want to make sure the top of the pattern piece faces the correct way with how the fur is going. And you want to line it up with the up and down arrow if your pattern piece has that. If you are wondering what pattern I'm using, it is down in the description box below. So I'm going to take some chalk and I'm going to start outlining it. Since this is a dark fabric, I am using some white chalk to outline it. And since this is a center back piece, we want it to be all connected, so we're just lining it up to continue, putting the chalk outline since we can't fold it in half and cut it that way. So for the front pieces, I did make some modifications to the pattern because Astrid's original capelet is rounded in the front. So I did a mock-up and then use that to be able to see where it would look good. And so just like we did with the back, we are now going to take the chalk and make an outline around it following these new rounded front. And you want to make sure that you have opposites. So for the one front piece, the pattern is facing up. For the other side, of course, it is facing down. Now comes the really long part of cutting out each piece. If you have watched the first video in this series, then you know that you want to basically just cut the backing. You don't want to cut through all of the fabric, so it requires a whole bunch of tiny little snips, which does take a long time. But the look afterwards is completely worth it. And of course, you know, if you got kitty friends, then they are more than happy to help you. So now with those pieces cut out, you are going to take and clip the two shoulder seams together, and you want to take and push the faux fur out of the way as much as possible to get a nice clean seam. And this will also help the seam not to be patchy and will require a whole lot less work later. I'm using a lot of clips for this just so that I don't have to fight the fur as much. I found that this also forces me to slow down when I'm sewing, so there are also a lot less mistakes, but you don't have to use as many clips. So now we are going to go ahead and use our sewing machine to sew these together, and just take your time with this because you want it to be right. And sometimes, as I learned, even with all of those clips, you do have to take and fix the fur a little bit. This is a medium pile fur, which is a lot more cantankerous than the long pile fur because it just doesn't like to stay where I wanted it to stay. But regardless, you want to do this for both of the shoulder seams. And just look how beautiful this seam is. So now you get to see a little twirl and how cute it looks with the front. And it is looking great so far. So let's move on to the hood. So for the hood, I also made some slight modifications. I rounded the top part, closed part, because I don't look pointy hoods. And so when you are putting this on the fabric and doing the outline once again, you just want to make sure that you line up the arrow with the way the fur moves and cut it just like you have been doing for the rest of the fur for this cosplay. More just tiny little snips and take your time because you do not want to mess this part up. And you will be cutting out a total of 4 hood pieces, 2 for the fur on the outside, and then 2 for the fur on the inside. Now, with the way her hood is designed, it has this darker on the outside, and then it looked like a white or a beige fur on the inside. So I ended up finding a white long pile fur to put on the inside. Once you're done with that, you're going to put them right sides together, and you're going to clip the whole um, outer and back side of the hood together. And these next couple steps you also want to do with the white fur as well. So this one is a little bit harder to sew because it does have the curve, but the curve does look better. Also, with this particular pattern, it's important to note that the hood is more of like an enchanted hood style, so it is huge. I was expecting that I would have to enlarge it. I did not enlarge it for this go around with it, and it is really, really big. So you should not have to make the hood any larger. It's just naturally huge. So once it's all clipped, now we get to the sewing part. And so you just want to be careful as you sew this, both the outer and the lining pieces. So because I chose a white fur for the inside, I chose a color chalk to outline on the back. And so you want to prepare this the same way you did for the dark fabric. When you have both of the hoods sewn, you're going to put them right sides together and clip them on each side because you are going to sew around the front part that goes around your face to give it a nice clean seam and transition. In the same way that you've done the other pieces by pushing the fur away from the seam to make it smaller and to give it more body once it's turned right side out. So here we are sewing it. I used a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this, and it seemed to work pretty well. And when I had problems, I just grabbed a pencil because my finger was just a little bit too big. I ended up pulling some of the fur back out. So when I used a pencil to push all of the furs in, that actually worked really well. Once you're done sewing it, you want to flip it right side out and make sure that it looks all nice. Then you can start clipping it to the actual cape part and getting it ready to sew. So I found the middle of the cape and used the middle seam on the hood to, to clip to that part, and then did each of the edges and clipped all around to keep it secured. Now, originally, as you can see, I tried to sew this by machine. However, it was way too thick, and so in the end, I ended up having to hand stitch it because in addition to the 3 layers of fur, I also had a cotton layer because my skin is really sensitive to any sort of itchy texture, and so I knew I had to have some sort of barrier. So now to finish up the cape, I grabbed some leftover pleather I had from the skirt and I made it 2 inches by 3 inches, and uh, that is going to give us a nice way to clasp the front closed. And so we are going to take a look at the sides and we are going to measure where about we want the front clasp to go. So I'm going to first grab my fabric measure tape and grab some chalk just so I can mark it. And so I'm marking it from where the hood attaches to the cape and seeing whereabouts I want to place it. So it's about 3.5 inches from that seam. So I'm going to get my chalk out and make a little mark. And this will give me a great place to start. So I'm just going to remeasure so that way I know where my line's supposed to go and make a little mark. And then of course you want to make the same mark on the other side. From here you want to measure that 3.5 inch and make a mark because you want them to be perfectly straight. So once you are done with that, it's time to place the pleather. And so we're just going to come back to this first side here and fold it in half. And we are going to place it between the lining and the outer piece, and the top of the pleather is going to be where you put your mark. If you do not have a lining, then you can just place it there on the inside so that the raw edges are hidden, and you are going to then clip it in place so that it can't go anywhere. And you want to make sure that you get all of the pieces clipped, so both sides of the pleather, the fur, and if you have a liner. Now, just to make it cleaner for me, I am going to fold over the seam allowance above where that piece is and a little bit below because when it's open, the front will fold open, and I want to make sure that that is nice and clean. So I have some serged edges, and so I'm just going to tuck that under, and it will create some nice clean lines. So you want to go ahead and sew from there down. And at this time, we are not putting the ring in, and you'll see why after we get this sewn. So we are going to flip it around the other way, and we are going to do the same thing. I'm going to start by folding under the seam allowance at the top before I place the pleather piece down. And because of my mark, I know exactly where to stop to give it some room. And when we are ready, we are going to grab the pleather piece, and the 3-inch side is the side that gets folded in half, and put it once again at the mark. So the top part goes where the mark is to make it a little bit easier. Flip it in place. And a little bit extra if you have a lining. And now we are ready to sew. This is another area that you want to take on the slower side because you want to make sure that you accurately sew all of the pieces. If you miss one of the layers, then you're going to have to take all of that stitching out and redo it. And let me tell you, it is not easy to seam rip faux fur. I promise you, you will not want that kind of headache on your hands. So once you are done, you're going to have these 2 loops, one on each side, and we have a nice top stitching with it back stitched at the top and the bottom because of the amount of pressure. So I am using book rings, and I like it because they can open, so it's easier to get on and off. This one is about 1.75 inches, and I ended up sizing up to a 3-inch ring because it looked closer to what it was in the original image, but it's easy to slide them on both loops. And then once you fit them through there, you can put the two pieces together. They lock in and it is secured. If you do use a smaller ring, you can fold each of the edges of the pleather under to give it a kind of angled look, but with the 3-inch ring, I did not need to do that at all. So that is how you finish it off. You can hide the hinge behind the pleather, and you have one completed capelet. And if you want to buy these rings, once again, they are called book rings. You can find a package of them at Walmart that look like this. But for the 3-inch ones, I did have to buy them online from Amazon. It was like $5 for a pack of 8. Not bad at all. So now you get to see the finished tutorial. We see the ring and do a fun little spin around. Here is what the hood looks like up. Thanks for joining me and stay tuned for the Astrid skirt part 2.